Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to welcome you tonight on Thanksgiving to this event at the WZB. For those of you who haven't been here before, the WZB is, according to our knowledge, the largest independent social science research center in Europe, housing some 150 academics and an equal number of support staff. Our mission is to engage in problem-oriented and yet fundamental research, and there aren't many other topics that could compete with the one of tonight when it comes to basic social science that is relevant for everyday problems. We all eat every day, making our choices when we stroll down the aisles of a supermarket. And what we buy there is not just for us, it is most often than not for others with whom we share, with whom we sit down to share not only a meal, but some of the best moments of every single day. Breaking bread together or carving a bird. This makes food a very emotional and personal topic. We all have to eat, and we like to do it in company. This is a deep-rooted fact, so deeply rooted that we don't question why it is the case. Luis Buñuel's The Phantom of Liberty imagines an alternative world where we spend quality time together defecating and where eating is private and embarrassing. Buñuel makes a wonderful point about customs and norms, but for whatever reasons, we have coordinated on the opposite model, where we share lunch or dinner with others when we want to engage in communality and lubricate current or future relations. There's also been recent research that shows how our decision-making depends on whether we recently had a meal or not. In a study by Shai Danziger of Ben-Gurion University has investigated how likely judges are to grant parole to prisoners. And hey, you don't want to plead your case when the judges are hungry. In the morning, your average chances for getting parole are around 65%. Briefly before lunch, they are almost zero. After lunch, they shoot back up to 65%. We all eat, we have to eat, and we have to be organized to eat. We need to gather and hunt in small shops around the corner or bigger ones further away. And in the process, our values and moral judgments might gain or lose relevance. Vast majorities of consumers in Western countries say that they object to factory farming, Massentierhaltung. And yet more than 95% of all meat that is consumed in the Western world stems from animals who live their short lives in factories, often, most of the time, under circumstances that we abhor. The dog, cat, hamster owners among us would probably pay vast amounts of money to avoid that their beloved pets would have to spend the rest of their lives in factory farming conditions. Tonight we will explore this complicated matter where beliefs and actions appear to be out of sync. We will have 3 talks, each for 30 minutes, and after that we will have a discussion with questions from the floor, also for half an hour. And after that, we will have, you can guess, we will offer you some food and wine outside. Our speakers today represent 3 different approaches to the topic. Our first speaker is Gerhard Manteuffel, a biologist from the Leibniz Institute for Farm Animal Biology at Rostock-Dommersdorf. Our second speaker is Melanie Joy, who made the long trip from Boston, who is a sociologist at the University of Massachusetts. And our final speaker is Bernd Ladwig, a political theorist and philosopher from Freie Universität Berlin. The discussion will be moderated by Nora Sech, an economist from the University of Karlsruhe and WZB fellow. Ladies and gentlemen, if you please welcome tonight's speakers. I give the floor to Gerhard Manteuffel.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for the invitation.
Therefore, when humans got more and more intelligent, they realized that it is much easier to keep animals penned than hunting them. Hunting was dangerous in those days and in many cases not successful. There was no ancient population that was vegetarian by choice. So domestication started in the Neolithic age, the Younger Stone Age, about 9,000 years ago. Why were animals domesticated? Because they were neat? No. Because they were beautiful? No. Because they were nice to pet? No. They were domesticated because they were useful. Time passed and not so much changed, except that more and more different races, you know that, of domesticated species were bred. Most animals were kept outside in summer and inside mostly narrow stables in winter, sometimes even tethered in houses living together with humans. The animals were used as heating then. Then after a while we arrived in the 19th and 20th century after Christ. What was needed was food for all the industrial workers and for the growing middle classes. During the wars and in the years after the wars, it was an important task of the administrations to stop hunger and undernourishment in the population. Therefore, in the 50s and 60s, programs for intensifying agricultural production, including animal production, were raised and executed with much emphasis, particularly in Europe and the United States, which exported much to Europe. Food products from animals were really needed to supply people with enough essential proteins in these days. Finally, people got accustomed to a rich supply with milk and meat products. Now in the US and Europe, but also to a high degree in China and Russia, there is a well-established tradition in preparing meals with those products. It is a result of a learning process that occurs in the families and in social groups in general. In the morning we have eggs and bacon, for lunch meat or fish and some vegetables, for dinner various sausages, cheese, etc., in detail depending on the country's special traditions. So the three main causes for intensification of animal farming are eliminate hunger and undernourishment after wars in Europe, making nourishment inexpensive to give consumers more options, and also an important point, more and safer incomes for the farmers. And this results, of course, in industrial farms with high outputs. Today, habits may change a bit, mostly in younger women in urban environments, to my observations. The reasons are different. In many cases, a main reason may be loving animals or seeing animals as cohabitants on Earth. The last is a bit strange because it is not a logically deducible reason for not killing animals, in my view. Leaving this apart, in general, people have a different view on pets and farm animals. You said that, Professor Hook said that already. And so it's the position of these species in society. Pets are companions, neat, lovely, always present, family members, or sports comrades, in the case of horses, for instance. Farm animals are kind of food producers, which most people do not know exactly how they live, for instance. Do people really want to know? What is the reality of keeping farm animals? Let's just start with the vocabulary. Modern farmers who breed animals are called animal producers in professional circles. Though they don't really produce animals, they still reproduce the animals, Hence, farm animals are products with a certain economic value, no other value beyond. As the English word livestock says. Laws of production and productivity are fully applicable, as in, say, bicycles or washing powders. The price of a slaughter pig is about 1.70 euros per kilogram. That is about 170 euros for an animal. And just to show you what that means, The example is piglet production. This is the whole pig production cycle, lasting about 23 weeks for a sow. This is a sow, and then there's farrowing. She gives birth. The piglets are born, and in the end, after about half a year or so, they have their finishing weight, here 60 to 100 kilograms, and then life is over, but not for the sow. The sow then, after weaning of the piglets, about 2 weeks or 3 weeks, sometimes in very good situations, 4 weeks, the piglets are weaned. They come, they were taken away from the mother. They are taken away from the mother, and then the mother is again fertilized and waiting and pregnant, and this part, this pregnant period is about a bit more than 100 days. And so we look for the sows here. How are the sows housed? Maybe you think this is the way it is. But this is the reality. You can see the sow easily. It's the most effective production. The mother sows are in crates. This is this small cage here. The piglets can go here and here, but the sow is always here. That's a crate, with up to 15 and sometimes even more piglets. A crate can easily sorry, a crate can easily be cleaned. The sow is always under control, but little natural behavior is possible. The crate, sorry, I've got the flu. The crate allows to stand up and lay down. The latter is a pity, that's a joke, because sows tend to crush piglets then. That's really a problem in these intensive farms. When the sows lay down, they lay on their piglets. In Europe, sows have to be free and in groups during pregnancy, after a transition period allowed by law until the end of the decade. The situation is different in US, Russia, and China, where the sows remain in the crates their whole lifespan in the most effective and industrialized farms. So the sow is the whole life in this small cage. Let us remember, in order to understand what the reasons are. People want to eat whatever, well, they want to eat well, whatever that means, I think, and want to pay little for it, so that they can buy other things that last longer than a meal. A car or a television set or something like that. These are the laws of market. So far, this is the status quo. But I think most people would agree that farm animals are sentient beings. They have kind of acute feelings and emotions, although we have no indications that they can imagine future fates or the end of living. According to all we know, they live in the present and they feel the actual situation. So it is the immediate environment and social encounters that count. And the question is, what can we do to improve the lives of our farm animals? We must know that there is some, and this is an important point, of course, that there is some world trade in animal products and international competition for markets. For a moment, we should forget this. Maybe too open markets are not always the best. I think we should start with a statement that people are free to eat what they want, and they should be. We may try to change the minds and habits of people by propaganda. Will this succeed in the case of eating without being dictatorial? Public media may help, but only to some degree. And in people, I think, who want to know and are already changing their mind. Anyway, this will be a long way if it will work at all. I think the best thing we can do more or less immediately is to improve the living conditions of the animals. This does not necessarily mean back to nature-like keeping or ancient farming. This would only create new problems, although with animal welfare. So let us give them suitable housings to which they can well adapt and which offer them conditions against boredom and which are not too simple and dull. This must be done particularly in intensive husbandry, where the vast majority of animals live. Are there ideas how to do this? Yes, they are existing. Just one example, and of course it's my own research in this field, which is based on animal cognition, calling sows individual to feeding. Sows used to compete to access to a feeding station, which can really be dangerous. At least it can produce injuries and pain. In order to prevent this, we have developed call feeding. And I show you a little film. Here she comes. And all the others do not realize or do not react to this call because they have other names. And this is an electronic feeder. And she is fed. And we have also applied this in a big, this was an experimental setup, in a big stable with very perfect conditions. I just show you. No, this was something was. Gibt's hier eine Maus? Entschuldigung? Nee, I have to go back. This should switch to the other film. Here it is. Okay. This was another name here, Beate. And all the other sows, they don't react. There's no competition. They have learned. They were trained for their names. They know their names, and they are rewarded. And this activates, altogether activates the rewarding unit in the brains of mammals, the nucleus accumbens system. And so there's a double kind of reward and success in the animals. So they have to learn something, namely the individual acoustic calling signature. It's just a sound for the pigs, not a name, of course, but the name is easy to handle for us who construct this. And they should be attentive. If they are, this is rewarded, not only with feed as such, but also with predictability, that they can enter the feeding station without competing with other pigs, and we have seen that very nicely. Now let's come to the resume. Better lives for our farm animals are surely costly. People will have to pay more for the products. Are they really willing? They claim to be, also you said that before, Professor Hook, but in many cases they don't do so when in the supermarket. Maybe we will need legislation for improving animal welfare in farming. Then the products get more expensive, and people can choose how frequently they eat how much of it. In my opinion, this will be the only realistic solution. In addition, we should look for animal welfare labels. These are the new German animal welfare labels, which you can find in some supermarkets already, at least the lower level with 1 star here. And the second level will be introduced soon. And this label is strictly looking for welfare. It's not the same as organic agriculture. So it's conventional agriculture, but with a high standard of animal welfare. And these labels, of course, have to be regularly controlled in the domestic and international sources of the products. And I come to the end. We should finally always remember that we are responsible for the farm animals and their living conditions. So every consumer is responsible, not only the farmers, because the farmers, they just give us what we want to have, cheap or not so cheap meat. So we are all responsible. And that's all I can suggest in the moment. Look for labels, look what you can do. You have not, to my opinion, in my opinion, you have not to look to eat no meat at all. But look for the origins. Thank you very much.
Let me get this slideshow. Is this on? Oh, they're going to turn it on. Wait, just before I want to get the presentation up before I. Yes, I will. Okay. Hi, good evening. Can you hear me? Okay. All right, so I'm Melanie Joy, and as Stefan said tonight, I came in from Boston this morning, and I'm incredibly excited to be here because Berlin is one of my favorite places in the entire world. I'll actually be moving here to live here in a few months, and I'm very excited about that. So thank you all for coming out tonight and to participate in this very important conversation. And I appreciated what you said about intensive farming, which I'm very heartened. Let me get out front here. I'm very heartened to hear that the conversation is starting to happen around intensive farming or factory farming, because I believe that that's a very serious problem. 95% of the meat, eggs, and dairy that make it to our plates comes from animals who were raised in these intensive conditions. But I'd like to suggest tonight that the problem is even deeper than intensive farming, that the real problem is a problem of consciousness. It's a psychological problem. It's about a disconnect, a psychological disconnect that we have. So it's a psychological issue and a social issue, and that's what I'll be talking about tonight. Now, before I talk about this psychological disconnect, I want to talk a little bit about the connection that so many of us have with animals. Whenever I start talking and giving this presentation, I always like to begin by pointing out how, these slides are just lovely, aren't they? And whenever I make new slides, it always takes me so long to find just the right images that convey the essence of what I'm trying to communicate. But not when it comes to images depicting the natural connection so many of us have with animals, and especially the connection children have with animals. I always find way more than I can use. I mean, there are literally thousands of pictures out there that really capture that childlike sense of wonder, that understanding, that caring. So because I'll be exploring this human, non-human connection tonight, I want to do a brief exercise with you to explore it a bit more fully. I'd like you to try to think of one or more animals in your life who you have felt a connection to. And by connection, I mean anything from identifying with an animal or animals to loving them. I simply mean caring about their well-being. So maybe it was the horse you took riding lessons on, or your neighbor's guinea pig. Maybe it was the dog you grew up with, or a hurt bird you rescued. Or maybe it was a fish or a turtle. So now I want to take a poll. Raise your hand if you were able to think of at least one animal. Okay, that was far too easy. More than one animal. That was easy too. Okay, now raise your hand if you've ever felt cared about or loved by an animal. Okay, that's a whole lot of love. And our experience tells us something important. We care about animals. We feel connected to them. And we can see examples of this everywhere. We teach our children to be kind to animals, not to harm them. We make animals the heroes of our children's stories and the stars of their shows. When we're walking in the woods and we catch a glimpse of a deer through the trees, or when we see dolphins leaping out of the ocean, or when we notice a delicate butterfly resting on a flower, we often feel that sense of awe that makes us just stop and speak in hushed voices and watch with what some might even call reverence. When we hear of an abused or mistreated animal, we recognize the injustice and we feel outraged. When we're at the petting zoo and the piglet chooses our hand to eat out of, we feel special. We get excited. Can you relate to some of these feelings? Now, I certainly can too. So before we get started, I want to tell you just a little bit about me and my story and how I came to be here today. This is a picture a long time ago now of me and my dog Fritz. My mother tells me that we adopted Fritz when he was about 2 months old and I was about 2 years old. So we were really both just babies when we met. Now, Fritz was my first dog, but he was also my first friend. We did everything together. We played together, we napped together, and we even vomited together once during a sickening summer road trip. And Fritz was also my first heartbreak when he died at the age of 13 of liver cancer. What I didn't realize back then was that Fritz would ultimately be the catalyst for my life's work, which is to raise awareness of this psychological disconnection. In other words, this gap in our consciousness when it comes to our relationship with animals, and in particular when it comes to eating animals. Now, this disconnect or this gap in our consciousness has a profound impact on ourselves and our world. It causes us to act against our deepest values and against our own interests and against the interests of others. So becoming aware of this gap is really my goal, and that's the key in many ways to personal empowerment, because without awareness, there is no free choice. So my goal here is to talk about how we can make our food choices more freely. Now, to talk about this gap in consciousness, I want to do another exercise with you. I'd like you to imagine that you are the guest at a dinner party, and your host serves you a dish that looks like this. I'd like you to consider whether you would find this delicious or disgusting. You don't have to raise your hand this time, don't worry. Okay. So for those of you who would find it delicious, I'd like you to imagine that you find it so delicious that you ask your host for the recipe. And she says, well, the secret is in the meat. You need to start out with 3 pounds of well-seasoned golden retriever. Okay, now take a moment to reflect on your thoughts and feelings. Chances are what you thought of just moments ago as food, you now think of as a dead animal. What you just felt was delicious, you now feel is disgusting. So chances are your experience of the meat dramatically changed, even though nothing about the meat itself actually changed. So what is it then that changed? Well, what changed was simply your perception of the meat. Now, our perception is the lens that we look at the world through. And when it comes to eating animals, our perception is shaped largely, if not entirely, by our culture. In meat-eating cultures around the world, people tend to have a tiny handful of animals out of thousands of possible species that they learn to classify as edible. All the rest we classify as inedible and disgusting, and often even offensive. So what's striking is not the presence of disgust. What's striking is the absence of disgust. Why are we not disgusted by the 8, 9, maybe 10 if you're an adventurous eater, species we've learned to classify as edible? And perhaps even more importantly, why don't we ever ask why? Have you ever wondered why you might eat chicken's wings, but not swan's wings? Leg of lamb, but not leg of kitten? They both come from baby animals. Have you ever wondered why you might eat fish soup, but not lizard soup? Hen's eggs, but not pigeon's eggs? You getting hungry? I can tell by your expressions. Have you ever wondered why you might drink cow's milk, but not pig's milk? And have you ever wondered why you haven't wondered? When it comes to edible animals, there is a psychological disconnect. We don't make the conscious connection between the meat on our plate and the living being it once was. For instance, like so many people, I grew up with a dog who I loved. And I also grew up eating animals. And over the course of so many years and so many meals, I never thought about how strange it was that I could be petting my dog with one hand while I ate a pork chop with the other. A pork chop that had once been an animal who was at least as intelligent, sensitive, and conscious as my dog. I never thought about the inconsistencies in my attitudes and behaviors toward these animals because I didn't actually think I was eating an animal when I was eating a pork chop. I just didn't make that connection. I didn't connect the dots. I had that knowing without knowing. I had a gap in my consciousness. And so the question then is, where does this gap come from, and what are its consequences? Well, for me, it was half a lifetime before I started asking these questions. It was 1989, and I had recently awoken to find myself hospitalized after having eaten a hamburger that was contaminated with the foodborne bacteria Campylobacter. Now, before I got sick, I had been increasingly uncomfortable with the idea of eating meat. I had seen or witnessed on a handful of occasions information about the horrors of animal agriculture. But and I knew on some level that eating animals was antithetical to my personal values. Like most people, I cared about animals, and I didn't want them to suffer, especially when that suffering was so intensive and so completely unnecessary. And yet I hadn't been ready to take that information in. So my response had always been, don't tell me that, you'll ruin my meal. But after I got sick, I never wanted to eat another hamburger or any meat again. And so I didn't. And then something interesting happened. When I stopped eating animals, I made the connection. I had a shift of consciousness, a paradigm shift. In other words, I didn't see different things. I saw the same things differently. And so I became very curious about how rational, caring people, just like myself, could just stop thinking when it came to eating animals. So I spent about 20 years looking for answers, including about a decade of research that culminated in my doctoral dissertation on the psychology of eating meat. And to share my findings with you, I want to start out by doing another quick exercise. So if vegan is the term we use to describe an individual who follows the tenets or the teachings of the belief system we call veganism, and vegetarian is the term we use to describe an individual who follows the tenets of the belief system we call vegetarianism, what then do we call someone who's not a vegan or vegetarian? You can just shout it out. Pescatarian, that's true. There are lots of new terms. Forget about flexitarian, pescatarian. Yeah, fruitarian, that's true. I'll go with the most basic ones. Omnivore, right? You say omnivore here, right? Carnivore, and then meat eater, right? So let's just take a moment to look at these terms, though. An omnivore, by definition, is an animal, human or non-human, who can ingest both flesh and plant matter, right? And a carnivore is an animal who needs to ingest flesh in order to survive. So both omnivore and carnivore describe one's biological predisposition, not one's ideological or philosophical choice. And meat eater describes a behavior as though it's divorced from a belief system. This is why we don't call vegans plant eaters, for instance, because we recognize that the behavior of eating plants reflects a deeper belief system or ideology. When eating animals is not a necessity for survival, which is the case in much of the world today, then it is a choice. And choices always stem from beliefs. So what I found is that there is an invisible belief system that conditions us to eat certain animals. And this is the belief system I came to call carnism. Now, carnism is a special kind of belief system or ideology. It's a dominant ideology. That means it's invisible, entrenched, it shapes norms, laws, beliefs, behaviors, etc. And it's also a violent ideology. Meat cannot be procured without violence, even in so-called organic facilities. And eggs and dairy cannot be procured without harming animals. And today, these two industries are arguably the most brutal of all carnistic industries. And dominant violent ideologies such as carnism need to use a set of social and psychological defense mechanisms to enable humane people to participate in inhumane practices without fully realizing what they are doing. In other words, carnism teaches us how not to feel. Now, the primary defense of the system is denial. And denial is expressed largely through invisibility. One way carnism remains invisible is by remaining unnamed. If we don't name it, we can't even think about it, so we can't question it. And carnism also keeps its victims out of sight, invisible, and therefore conveniently out of public consciousness. So, for example, 14,269 farmed animals are killed in the EU, and this, by the way, is not including fish and aquatic life. This is only land animals, okay? 14,269 farmed animals are killed in the EU, not every week, or every day, or even every hour, but every single minute. That adds up to about 7.5 billion animals per year. So in the time it took us to do this exercise, to do this slide, over 14,000 animals were just slaughtered right here in Europe. But think about it. How many farmed animals have you seen? I mean, given that these animals' body parts are literally everywhere we turn, why don't we ever see them alive? Well, we don't see the animals whose bodies become our food because we're not supposed to. Over 95% of the meat, eggs, and dairy, as we've mentioned before, that make it to our plates come from animals who were raised in factory farms. They're windowless sheds in remote locations that are virtually impossible to obtain access to. Now, what I'm going to do is show you a very short, it's about a 2-minute video that gives you an inside look on factory farms. It's undercover footage of animal factories. But before I do, I want to give you a heads up. My goal here today is to raise awareness, not to distress you, even though some of this video may be distressing. And to do that, I have got to make the invisible visible. So I want to encourage you to watch this very short video because I believe that the few moments of discomfort you feel will be well worth the empowerment that awareness ultimately brings. And thousands of people have told me this over the years. I've tried to select material that's sufficient to inform you without traumatizing you. But I also wanted to encourage you to pay attention to yourself. Some of you have seen this before and you don't need to see it again. And for others it might just be too much. So just plug your ears, close your eyes if you need to. I'm going to skip over this. How are we for sound? Thank you for bearing witness to this, for watching this. I know it's not easy, and this is about 2 minutes long, and it always feels like in my hour-long presentation, it's 4 minutes out of an hour, and people always say it's the longest part of the whole presentation. You know, before we move on, I want to point out that much of what you have seen here are in fact standard industry practices that apply to so-called organic and free-range facilities as well. And of course, as Garad pointed out, these animals are sentient, intelligent beings. I mean, most people today do not dispute the fact that animals have the capacity to feel pleasure and pain and joy and have lives that matter to them. But as I mentioned earlier, animals are not the only victims of carnism. Another group of invisible victims are the slaughterhouse workers who have to work in a death-saturated, highly dangerous environment and, not surprisingly, have been found to have high rates of post-traumatic stress and addictions. In fact, in 2005, for the first time ever, Human Rights Watch issued a report criticizing a single US industry, the meat industry, for working conditions so appalling they violate basic human rights. And our environment is an invisible victim of carnism. According to the United Nations, animal agriculture is one of the most significant contributors to the most serious environmental problems facing the world today. And greenhouse gas emissions caused by livestock exceed that of all forms of transportation combined. And we are the invisible victims of carnism. We pay for our carnism with our health, as eating animals has been linked with the leading diseases in the Western world, including obesity, cancer, heart disease, diabetes. The editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Cardiology says the best way to prevent heart disease is to not eat animals. The chair of nutrition at the Harvard School of Public Health says that replacing meat with plant sources of protein is associated with lower risks of some of the leading diseases today. And the manager of clinical education programs at the renowned Joslin Diabetes Center talks about how a vegan diet can help prevent and treat diabetes. So we pay for our carnism with our health. But we also pay for our carnism with our hearts and with our minds. We pay for our carnism with the gap in our consciousness. Now, we've talked about denial and invisibility, the main defense of the system, but invisibility can only protect the system so much. So when invisibility inevitably falters, we need to be able to justify eating animals. And the way that we learn to justify eating animals is by learning to believe that the myths of meat, eggs, and dairy are the facts of meat, eggs, and dairy. Now, there's a vast mythology surrounding eating animals, but all of these myths fall under what I refer to as the 3 N's of justification. You could probably guess what they are. Eating animals is normal, natural, and necessary. And of course, these same arguments have been used to justify violent practices throughout human history. So let's briefly look at each of these myths in turn. Eating animals is normal. Well, what we call normal is really the beliefs and behaviors of the dominant culture. It is the carnistic norm. And carnism as a social norm is so entrenched that it's impossible to see unless we step outside the box. So I want to do another exercise with you. I'd like you to imagine that you're back at that dinner party where your host has just told you that you're eating a golden retriever. Sorry. But now imagine that you tell your host how you feel. And she replies by telling you not to worry, not to feel bad, because the dog had a good life. She was able to run and play, and she even formed friendships with some other golden retrievers and some people before she was killed at 6 months old. Does she taste any better now? No, I didn't think so. So in some ways, she tastes even worse because she had a life she was invested in continuing to live. So ask yourself if you would be opposed to a perfectly healthy golden retriever being killed simply because people like the way her thighs taste. Why might you not be opposed to the exact same thing being done to somebody else? Carnism as a social norm is so entrenched that it blinds us to the fact that organic or humane meat is a contradiction in terms. Organic or humane meat it's a myth. It is a myth constructed by those in the business of violence to appeal to those of us who would ordinarily never support such violence. Okay, eating animals is natural. Well, what we call natural is simply the dominant culture's interpretation of history. It refers not to human history, but to carnistic history. In other words, it references not our fruit-eating ancestors, but rather their flesh-eating descendants. So we only look as far back in history as we need to justify our current carnistic practices. And to be fair, murder and rape are arguably as long-standing and therefore as natural as eating animals, and yet we don't use these as a justification for them today. And finally, eating animals is necessary. Well, what we call necessary is simply what's necessary to maintain the dominant culture. And here I will simply let a picture speak for itself. This is the number of animals killed since opening this slide. Now, sometimes people say that eating animals is necessary for nutrition, often manifested in the protein myth. But as we know today, this is, in fact, a myth. In fact, did you know that you could be strong enough to lift a car without having eaten an ounce of animal protein in your life? It's true. And here in Germany, Germany's strongest man is actually a vegan. So the myths of meat prevail despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, and they prevail because carnism is institutionalized. And when we are born into an institutionalized system, we inevitably absorb that system's logic as our own. In other words, we learn to look at the world through the lens of carnism. And carnism uses a set of defenses that distort our perceptions of meat, eggs, and dairy in the animals that we eat. For example, carnism teaches us to see animals as abstractions, as lacking in any individuality or personality of their own. A pig is a pig, and all pigs are the same. And as with other victims of violent ideologies, we give them numbers rather than names. And when we look at the world through the lens of carnism, we fail to see the absurdities of the system. So we see images like this or this, and we take no notice rather than take offense. Or we see images like this or this, and we laugh rather than cry. Voltaire was right. If we believe absurdities, we shall commit atrocities. And carnism is but one of the many atrocities, one of the many violent ideologies that are an unfortunate part of the human legacy. And although the experience of each set of victims will always be somewhat unique, the ideologies themselves are structurally similar because the mentality that enables such violence is the same. It is the mentality of domination and subjugation, of privilege and oppression. It's the mentality that causes us to turn someone into something, to reduce a life to a unit of production, to erase someone's being. It is the might makes right mentality that makes us feel entitled to wield complete control over the lives and deaths of those with less power, just because we can, and to feel justified in our actions because they're only savages, women, animals. It is the mentality of meat. And this is why it is so important to recognize that eating animals is not simply a matter of personal ethics. It is the inevitable end result of a deeply entrenched oppressive ism. Eating animals is a social justice issue. So now that we've talked about the problem of carnism, the problem of carnistic defenses, what do we do about them? What is the solution to the problem? Well, the solution can be found in a question. Why do we use these defenses in the first place? Why go through all the psychological gymnastics in the first place? And the answer is because we care. We care about animals, we care about justice, and we care about the truth. Carnism depends on our not caring, and the system is built on deception. So our caring is both the problem and the solution. Our caring is what makes us want to turn away from the truth. But our caring is also what gives us the courage to face the truth, or the courage to bear witness. When we bear witness, that means that we see the truth with our eyes and minds as well as with our hearts. We empathize. When we bear witness, we make the connection. We close the gap in our consciousness, and we become more empowered. We're more in alignment with our core values, values such as compassion and honesty and justice. You know, if you think about it, throughout the history of humankind, virtually every atrocity was made possible because the populace turned away from a reality that they felt was too painful to face. And virtually every revolution, every social transformation was made possible because a group of people chose to bear witness, and they demanded that others bear witness as well. So the good news is that despite what mainstream carnistic culture would have us believe, there is reason to be very, very hopeful. And that is because the vegan movement, which is the counterpoint to carnism, is thriving. It is growing and expanding around the world today. More and more people are waking up, becoming aware, and saying no to carnism, to all forms of carnism, including so-called organic and humane meat, eggs, and dairy. So moving beyond carnism ultimately enables us to step into a vibrant community of millions of people and to become a part of something that's greater than our individual selves. So coming full circle, back to the this is 1980 when I made this picture. Fritz, as you may recall, who was my first dog, was in many ways also my first teacher. Fritz taught me that love, which is the highest form of connection and the highest expression of justice, should not be limited by arbitrary boundaries such as species. To love someone is to respect their being. It's to respect that no matter how different from us they are, they have a life that matters to them. Fritz taught me to be a witness. He taught me that love is a verb. So this is why the goal of my talk tonight, the goal of my life's work really, has been to raise awareness of the violent system that is carnism. Because for better or worse, we are all participants in this system. So our choice is not whether we participate, but how we participate. And with awareness, we can choose to be active witnesses rather than passive bystanders. With awareness, we can lead more authentic and freely chosen lives. And then we can truly become, as Gandhi said, the change that we wish to see. Thank you.
That does not sound good. So first of all, I have to apologize because I have nothing to offer that is phenomenologically impressive than what we've heard just a few minutes ago. I have to say things that are much more abstract, but on the other hand, I think emotions and thoughts have to be combined in order to convince people. And I will say a few words, first of all, why I'm dealing with this issue at first place, because I think this is not self-evident, because I'm a political theorist and a political philosopher, and it is not a well-established topic in political theory and philosophy today, that we think about human-animal relations. But I can make this short because the most important reason Melanie Joy has already given. Then I will say a few words concerning justification. So, what can we say about what I will call the moral status of sentient animals, and what does follow from a particular account of these moral status of sentient animals for the question of meat eating? And as you will see, in the consequences are much in line with you, maybe not in all the details of the justificatory process, but I think this is of secondary importance. Okay, first of all, why I'm interested as a political philosopher in such a topic? Now, as you already said, human-animal relations are not simply a matter of individual behavior and habit, but they are a matter of institutionalized practices. And however you want to characterize these practices in terms of injustice, of oppression, of a violation of basic rights, or of a violation of basic components of welfare, it is always the same central point here, that you have a system. Melanie Joy termed it carnism, but however you will name it, it is a system which is an essential part of what the American philosopher John Rawls calls the basic structure of society. It's embedded in the most important institutions and institutionalized practices of our modern societies, in ways that are pretty obvious and in ways that are hidden. For example, concerning research, concerning education, concerning clothing, concerning agriculture, concerning military, concerning culture and music production, what you want. In myriads of regards, it is crucial that we as humans make use of animals, and therefore we cannot simply, and of course we have laws that give room for such a usage. So it is an institutionalized practice for which we are responsible, not simply as natural individuals, as individual persons, but as citizens who take responsibility, at least in a democracy, for the way in which our legislature works, our most important institutions work, and so forth. So that is the reason. And just to give you a hint, with a colleague of mine, Peter Niesen, he's a professor for political theory in Hamburg, at the University of Hamburg, I'm organizing at the moment a conference. It will be called Animal Politics, and it will be an attempt to establish human-animal relations as a central topic in political theory. Maybe it will work, maybe not, because most of my colleagues, I think, are not still convinced that it is part of what we should be concerned about, but I think we can convince at least some of them. Let's see. So the next point then is, but I will make this point rather short, but it's part of the picture, is about morality. Because I am convinced, again, this is not common sense in political theory, but I think it is demonstrably right. I am convinced that morality is important for politics in the sense that, for example, we judge our systems with regard to its justice or injustice, with regard to respect or disrespect for basic rights, with respect or disrespect for equality, which is, for example, important for justifying democratic systems and so on. So in that sense, morality matters from a political point of view too. Now, a basic question for moral thinking is, what sort of entities have moral status? That is, what sort of entities count in and by themselves? So, for example, if I destroy a beautiful picture, have I done wrong to the picture as a picture, or have I done to those lovers of arts and the painter herself, which are then harmed in some way by seeing this beautiful or even not beautiful picture destroyed. So in that sense, I think most of us would say pictures don't have a moral status in and by themselves, but the lovers of arts, the painters and so on have animals a moral status in and by themselves. And to make a long story short, I think most of us intuitively now would agree that they have at least some status. That means if, for example, you kick a dog in the side, or you simply, for reasons of joy, harm a cat, or even a rat. Don't always look at the nice animals, the beautiful animals. Think about the ugly ones as well. That's also part of the story. If you just out of fun harm a snake, a rat, even then I think we would agree that it is not a morally neutral thing that we do. And it is also not only wrong because I'm doing something to myself. For example, I'm degrading myself by treating the animal in this or that way, which is cruel. But I'm doing something wrong to the animal. So in that sense, I think animals have some moral status. Now, of course, the next question is, what sort of status do they have, given they have one? And there are some basic accounts here. One is welfarism, and one is animal rights position, which is in itself a differentiated position. Now again, to make a long story short, I think the most straightforward way to establish or to make sense of the idea and to give a coherent account of the idea of moral status of animals is in terms of some rights of animals. And that can be expressed in the following way. It's an idea made explicit, for example, by the philosopher Joseph Raz. You can say that basically a being has a right, if and only if one of her interests, an aspect of her well-being, you might also say, is sufficient to hold some other person or party under a duty with regard to this very same being. So if my interest, for example, in being able to consume healthy food is sufficient to say that there are some duty bearers that have to secure that I have access to healthy food, then in that sense I have a right. And that you can also say means that having a right is a valid, in that sense, a morally valid claim that I can make, either directly or in the name of some other being who is not by him or herself able to raise his voice. But we can say, with regard to one of her interests, there is something at stake that is morally important from the point of view of that being. And in that sense, we can wrong this being. If you want a test for whether a being has this sort of status, has a right, you can always ask yourself, do you wrong somebody if you harm her? Or do you something that might be morally dubious or wrong, but not directly to the being? That is the victim of the practice, but to some third party. And I think, again, intuitively, when we think a bit harder about these questions, we would agree, most of us, that in some respects, we can directly harm animals so that we wrong them. That, I think, is at least a plausible position, and it's some sort of my starting point. So the next thing is, of course, what sort of account for rights should we have, given that there are many? And I don't want to go into detail here, but again, simply as a thesis, I would say that the most straightforward way to justify rights is, as I already mentioned, in terms of interests. And now that would mean that if you have a being, you have first of all look and see whether this being can have interests, and then secondly, whether these interests are morally weighty, whether they are morally relevant or important or urgent, and thirdly, whether it is possible to address a duty to some third party with regard to this interest. So in order to establish rights, you need these three things. First of all, identify interests. Secondly, demonstrate that they are morally relevant. And thirdly, then also demonstrate that some other party can have a duty with regard to this interest because it is so important for the being at stake. If you can show this, then you can establish rights. So in that sense, for example, we might not have a straightforward right to be loved, because love is a gift. So in that sense, no one can have a duty to love me, maybe, but we can have, let's say, a right to caring if we need caring, and others can be in a position to be duty bearers in that regard. So is it possible, that is then the next question, of course, to answer these three questions with regard to at least some animals positively? And I would say, first of all, in order to identify interests, it makes sense to take sentience as a necessary and sufficient condition. At least I think it's sufficient. Sentience means that you have a first-person perspective, you have some sort of phenomenological consciousness, which I think does imply that it matters for this being how it goes in his life. So such a being which is sentient can experience his or her own life as better or worse for her or himself. Yeah. So in that sense, I think sentience is, I think, a rather uncontroversial, let's say at least a sufficient condition for talking about interests. I don't think that artifacts have interests. I don't think that plants have interests. I don't think that rather primitive animals, such as Korallen, I don't know, have interests, Seegurken. But clearly all vertebrates have interests, including fish, for example, including, most obviously, octopuses and the like. And I think this is sufficient because the animals we are talking about when talking about meat eating and human usage are all members of this class of vertebrates. So this is the first thing. Animals have interests. Are they morally relevant? Well, in order to answer this question, some sort of anthropocentric move is necessary, because we, among the animal kingdom on Earth, are the only beings who are able to answer the question, what is morally important? Only we can do that. And then, okay, we can ask ourselves, what do we find morally important concerning our own well-being? Is it morally important when we feel enduring pain? Is it morally important when we feel lonely? Is it morally important when we feel unfree, when we feel some sort of sensory deprivation, or what you like? There are, to be sure, there are many respects in which we think something that might happen to us is morally important, which is not relevant for other animals. So we as human persons can suffer in regards that are not accessible for other beings, because in order to suffer in those regards, you have to have some sort of capacity to reason, to think about your own moral status. In order to be humanized in a strict sense of that term, you have to be able to realize your own moral status. In order to have an interest in political voting, you have to have a concept of what voting means. So in that sense, not all that we find morally important as rational and reasonable persons can simply also be applied to all other animals. And of course, the animals, again, are very different. You have different sorts of animals. You have more or less social animals. You have more or less, you have carnivores, you have omnivores, you have what you want. You have animals which are highly interested, as far as our behavioral evidence shows us, in moving around in large distances, and others are might be more able to live in a small area. So some are dependent upon human beings. Dogs are genetically endowed to be companions of humans. That makes a difference to wolves, for example. So in that sense, not only is there a difference in the interests we have as humans compared to all the other animals, but there are also other interests that are different among the animal kingdom itself. So in that sense, what the idea is not that either you have all the interests on the list that we find morally relevant, then what matters to you is also morally relevant. But are there some interests in which we will find out that what matters to us matters to them too? Of course, you might say, why is it important whether it matters to us at first place? Now, I think for a simple epistemological reason. Because the only way we can grasp what might matter for other beings is when we begin by ourselves and then look and see whether we find enough similarity in the behavior and so on of other beings, in the biological history which connects us with them, and the like. So although this is anthropocentric in the sense that we cannot but feel responsible for thinking about these cases because the animals can't, the consequences nevertheless might be highly relevant for many other sentient beings as well. They can't reason, but as a famous quotation is from Jeremy Bentham, they can suffer. And suffering is important for us too, not only because it is instrumentally important for us because we are rational and reasonable beings, but enduring pain is in itself worse, for example. And if it is so, then I think it is clearly arbitrary to say, well, if it is an animal that feels the pain, that feels a pain that is comparable to the one a human being might feel, then it doesn't matter. Or even then it doesn't matter as much as in our case. And that, of course, leads directly to one of the most famous criticisms of animal ethics concerning conventional morality, namely the point that we cannot be a speciesist for the basically same reasons why we can't be racist, why we can't be sexist and the like, because being speciesist means that the only reason why you treat different beings differently is because of their biological membership. And if this is the only reason you can give for differential treatment, then this is as arbitrary, demonstrably, as it is to differentiate beings simply because of their sex or gender, or because of the color of their skin, or what you like. Again, this does not mean that human beings might not be special in some morally relevant regards. This is not what I want to suggest here, of course. The only point is that morality commits us to the principle to treat like cases alike. And if you take interests to be morally relevant, and if in some regards concerning interests another being is quite similar to a human being, then it cannot matter as such that the one who's suffering is a human being, the other is just an animal. This is arbitrary. And of course, this is a basic principle of justice. Don't make arbitrary distinctions and differentiations in morally relevant regards. Okay, now, what about the moral relevance of interests that are at stake in the meat industry? And what about corresponding duties? The third question we have to answer in order to establish rights of animals with regard to agriculture and the like. Now, first of all, I think what is most obvious, and what Melanie Joy has shown by way of this short film and many examples, is that a factual precondition of meat eating in almost all cases, not in all, but in almost all cases, is a huge amount of suffering. So one way of frustrating the interests of sentient animals is by causing them to suffer. One way to cause suffering is causing pain, but that's not all that is relevant here. There are other things that also make animals, sentient animals, suffer, given that they have this or that condition. For example, animals might suffer from fear and terror. They might suffer from loneliness. They might suffer from sensorical deprivation and a few other things. And of course, all of this is in some way or other present in the meat industry, in factory farming. And if you think about animal transportation and conventional slaughterhouses, it is also part of most of the biological farming as well, as far as this farming is aimed at producing flesh, for example. So in that sense, I think you can simply say that one type of interests which is frustrated by the meat industry in almost all cases as a factual precondition of our ability to eat meat is that animals are harmed in different regards. So you make them suffer. Make someone suffer is a way of harming them. I just want to add that there is a second question which is logically distinguishable from this first one, although it is de facto often closely connected. That is the question whether you can also harm a sentient animal by killing it, him or her. Is killing a sentient animal harming this animal, and therefore prima facie wrong or not? At that point, animal ethicists disagree. Some would say that killing as such count as a harm for the victim presupposes that the victim have a sense of him or herself as a being that exists in time. So you have a pretty good you have to have a pretty good organized memory in order to be what John Locke calls a person, so that you can remember that you was the baby, not the baby, but the young child with the dog, and then you are this sort of professor, and in 20 years you will be this old person with some needs for help or whatever you want. And in that sense, only those persons can make life plans. And what's basically wrong with killing is that you frustrate life plans or future-oriented desires. That is a position that is held, for example, by Peter Singer and others. And I think you can argue for it, but I think it's wrong. And again, I will just I will just give you the alternative I favor without having time to give you the full account that backs up this position of mine. The alternative would be to say, well, in order to harm someone, you need not cause him or her suffer. That is one way of harming, causing suffering of this being. Another way to harm someone is to deprive someone of something which would be good for that being if it had the opportunity to enjoy it. And in that sense, I would say killing someone, even painlessly, what almost never happens, but again, even if you could kill someone painlessly during night, totally sudden, then you harm this being simply because you deprive it of a future that most likely this being would have enjoyed. Of course, there are some marginal cases in which this condition is not met, so maybe the future is so dark for this being that it would be better off to be killed soon. But in normal cases, I think sentient animals do not only have instincts to stay alive. They instinctively defend their lives, as you could easily see in the slaughterhouses. But I think we could also say that it would be a good thing for them, objectively speaking, to have this ability to stay alive. Again, I think even if you just concentrate on the first sorts of interests that I talked about, the interest in not being the victim of suffering, this would suffice to show that the meat industry is wrong. But of course, you have additional strength for this proposition if you can also make the point that killing itself under normal conditions is a way of harming a being. So, okay, then my final part will be the following. I think we can say that these are regards which are not only describable as frustrations of interests of sentient beings, which also fulfill the condition of moral relevance. So it is morally relevant whether a being suffers or not, at least if we are responsible for the conditions under which this being lives. I think this is clearly morally relevant because we have alternatives concerning the ways in which we construct these conditions for this being, which is dependent on our behavior. So this is the first thing. Now, of course, in order to determine our duties with regard to animals, we also have to look on the other side. What is at stake for human beings? Aren't there any interests which are relevant here? And of course, there are interests that are relevant. The most obvious thing is that you can say that many human beings have an interest in meat eating because meat, for many of them, tastes well. It can be unhealthy, but it mustn't. I would say this empirical point is not so clear-cut. Maybe a moderate meat eater can live a pretty healthy life. But, okay, apart from that, there are pretty good restaurants. I personally like good restaurants, and there you can have pretty good meals prepared by meat. So, and there are other things, for example, cultural reasons why human beings think it's part of their tradition to have meat. It's a way of honoring someone if you present him meat and not only vegetables and the like. So these are interests. Are they sufficiently strong to outweigh the interests that are at stake at the side of animals? And here's a proposition, I think it is obviously true, at least with regard to us who are living in Western metropolitan areas, such as Berlin, Baltimore, or the like. And the truth is this. Humans can enjoy meat, might enjoy meat, but they clearly have alternatives. They don't need it in order to have a healthy nutrition. That has already been said, and I think you can demonstrate it, at least for almost all kinds of persons regarding vegetarianism, and most of them also regarding veganism. But I think it is clear that there are alternatives, and these alternatives could be fostered. So what we find on our side is mostly an interest which is a minor or luxury interest. It is an interest, but it is minor. If you compare it, and this is the other side of the coin, with what is at stake for the animals. And as already said, for the animals, the thing that is most obviously at stake is their interest in not harming, in not being harmed in the sense of suffer from fear, from pain, from loneliness, from deprivation, from all these things. And I think, as I already said, I also say what is at stake is a genuine interest in staying alive for most of them. And these are basic interests. So on the side of the humans, you have minor interests, secondary interests, luxury interests. On the side of the animals, you have basic interests. And this sort of clash of interests leads to a clear conclusion, namely that a minor interest cannot outweigh a basic interest. And because the simple fact that the minor interest is on the side of us humans, and the basic interest is on the side of other sentient animals, does not make a moral difference in and by itself, then I think we have a moral duty to give up meat eating. I think this is pretty clear. Even if you only look on the side of suffering and don't also concentrate on the more problematic point whether killing as such is a way of harming the animal. That suffices. Let me very shortly note two things at the end. Two possible objections might come to mind here. First thing is, or three. First thing is an argument given by Leslie Stephen, an English writer of the early 20th century. Leslie Stephen said, well, a pig is basically interested in our meat eating because otherwise millions and billions of pigs wouldn't even existed. So they simply exist because we are interested in their meat or other products. Why is this argument flawed? And I think it is flawed because logically, if you have a being, you have first of all determined the moral status of this being, and then you can say what are legitimate reasons for bringing this being into existence and for treating him or her. I think this is pretty obvious in the case of humans. I would not have existed if my parents would not have had sexual intercourse. Yeah? Do my parents have a right to sell my organs? Did they have it when I was 2 years old? Obviously not. Because in bringing a human being into existence, one undertakes a particular responsibility which stems from the moral status of this newborn individual. And this is completely the same in the case of other animals. So if meat eating is not a legitimate reason for killing animals, and it is also not a legitimate reason for bringing them into existence and raising them. So this cannot count as an objection. The second thing is, well, you might argue that de facto there are morally important interests on the side of human beings, which we should not neglect when judging morally all these problems. Namely, all those human beings whose economic existence depend upon the existence of the meat industry are, of course, stakeholders here. So you can say that for someone losing his or her economic existence, of course, is a morally heavily relevant interest. That is true. And because these are not simply criminals, but these are people who undertake some roles in a political and juridical and societal system that we all in some way or other are responsible for and take part of and profit from, then I think we have some duties concerning these human beings. But it is not a duty to continue with a system which is basically unjust. But it is a duty to compensate them for the losses they have to accept for overly important reasons of justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we had 3 very interesting talks, and I would now welcome you to the podium so that we have some discussion. And you are very welcome to ask questions. I would just ask you to keep it short. That would be great. And I think before we open the floor to discussions, I would like to have some brief discussions between you, if you don't mind. For example, I sat next to you and I already saw that you have some, you took some notes.
Lots of remarks. So I basically agree with all the others, but there are some points which are different from me. And also difficult, and it's just hard to just pick up one and this, it's at least it's clear, I think, that if we stop eating pigs, then pigs will not exist in future. Most of them. Wild boars will exist, truly, but the others not. So this is, of course, but it's more or less trivial. I think everybody knows. Carnism is a point which is very interesting, and I can, I would agree with you in many points, but my only fear is that it's a bit, I had the impression that you are a bit religious in that way. Religious, and you have strong beliefs, and it's my fear that it can be dictatorial then. If we make a revolution in veganism, then it can be dangerous. So my approach is quite different. That will be the last I say here now. Is I think as long as these animals exist, and we can't get rid of all these farm animals at once, I hope you will agree that. So you try, but they will exist in future days, maybe for 10, 20 or more years. Then we have to look that for as good as possible welfare of these existing animals. So I hope you don't mean that we just have to get rid of all farming and all these animals and everything is clear. But unless this is true, we have to do something for the animals. Don't you agree?
So Melanie, you want to respond first, and then you...
Yeah, thank you. I understand what you're saying, and I would suggest that carnism is probably more religious than veganism is. Carnism incurs an illogical loyalty to continuing a practice that is clearly against our own interests and the interests of others in many, many ways. Most people do not feel comfortable eating animals, and yet most people continue to eat animals. And the reasons that they do are reasons that they give are because I like the way animals taste, or I was raised eating animals. It's legitimate that we are socialized to eat animals in this way. That's absolutely legitimate. But the illogical loyalty to maintaining a system that's so clearly antithetical to core human values and the kind of values and really democratic society that we all want to maintain, to create and maintain, to me is, there's much more of an emotional charge around carnism than there is in some ways around veganism. Often veganism is perceived as being, I don't remember the word you used, dogmatic, perhaps? Yeah. Dogmatic, and this is a criticism of all minority, like ideological minority standings. I mean, people who were fighting for the abolition of human slaves were accused of being overly emotional, for instance, or sensationalist, or there's a slippery slope. Where is this going to end? And it's one way that dominant systems maintain themselves, which is by marginalizing those who challenge the systems and painting them as appearing dogmatic and overly emotional at times. And I would suggest that, and you didn't say that, that there was too much emotion in this issue, but dogmatism often suggests that there's heightened emotionality and less rationality. I would suggest that not eating animals and acting in accordance with the values we all espouse is in fact far more rational than continuing to do something that we really don't believe in on a deeper level. And I would also suggest that when it comes to the atrocity that is animal agriculture, the world needs more emotion, not less. The dominant culture, in my opinion, is not emotional enough in some ways when it comes to this issue. In terms of, what would we do with all the farmed animals, obviously change is not going to happen overnight. No social change happens overnight. And I think, the conversation that we're having today is going to be very different than the conversation we have in 50 years, when people's consciousness has changed and when there are far fewer farmed animals being bred and for human consumption.
But just a little question. You always say we. What do you mean with we? Do you also include the Chinese, or they eat dogs, as you know? And,
some Chinese eat dogs.
Yeah, many Chinese, and they eat pigs and so on, and all the many cultures in the world are not Western cultures. Are Are they minor to us?
Well, in my book was the first foreign language that my book on carnism was published in, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows, was Korea, actually. And you're right, some Chinese eat dogs, and some Chinese are vegan and practicing vegans because it's in alignment with their values, their ideology, Buddhists, for example, or philosophical vegans. So what we see, what anthropologists have found, is that even though the type of species consumed changes from culture to culture, members of all cultures tend to have a similar relationship with eating animals. Some animals are classified as edible, and some are inedible. Some cultures have higher rates, higher levels of carnism. They eat more types of animals, but there are always taboo animals. And there's always a distance that needs to be maintained between the individual and the animal or the species.
That's right, yeah.